So, welcome to our study of the Guide for the Perplexed. We are about to study chapter 30 in book 2. And if you recall, the Rambam gave us two introductions, right? Before he's about to teach us about how to learn. He promised us way back in the beginning that he was going to teach us how to learn Maaseh Bereshit, which meaning the what Rambam calls physics, right? Meaning the science as it's presented in the story of the creation. Now, so he gave us uh, um, two introductions. One of them being that it's not literal; it's not meant to be literal, right? You can't read it at a simple level. And the second was that they often use words that mean more than one thing. So the word can, in one place can mean, and you have to understand the context in order to understand what the word means in that particular context. Those were his two introductions, and now he's going to talk to us about he's going to read through the first chapter of Bereshit. It might be worthwhile to have a chumash in front of you, because he's going to go through it, different verses, just to have it in front of you. Now, I wanted to say that um, I wanted to remind you of when I read from Rav Kapach. He's the translator of the Hebrew version that I use most of the time, and he writes a nice little commentary on the bottom. How when the Rambam stated that it's not literal, what he achieved a lot of things, but one of the things he achieved by stating that is that is that is that if science were to change, right? If the way people understand the world were to change, then it doesn't take anything away from the verses, right? So like sometimes there was a time in my life I remember when I used to get upset when I read scientific explanations for Bereshit. Like, so some guy, this guys that write, there's a lot of books out there that show how Genesis really jives very well with our understanding of science. They'll show how in Genesis you could see evolution because it starts with simpler things and gets more complex, and different ways they tried to do it. I'm not here to judge them and say which ones are good or bad, and that's not the point. The point is, I used to say, well, this is crazy because if you're telling me that this is how you understand the Torah, and then in 5 years someone's going to disprove the science that you just stated, and then they'll say the Torah is no good. But what the Rambam told us already before he makes his own attempt, based on his understanding of science, to understand what the Torah means, he already told us that not to worry because this is just the way he's explaining it. And if the words aren't literal, if you disprove this science, maybe it means something else. In other words, it doesn't. But so he's kind of teaching us how we could read it, but not necessarily how it has to be read. So let's go ahead and we'll see it. So this can help us when we learn through the Torah, and it seems to and the simple meaning of the verses seem to conflict with science. Well, if we look at it carefully, you'll see that you're not supposed to interpret it by the simple meaning. You're supposed to, you interpret it in another way, and then you realize that it doesn't really conflict with science at all. So let's go ahead and start chapter 30. No starters. He's gonna analyze the word Bereshit, right? The first word of the Torah. And just to remind you, in case you don't know, which I'm sure you do, Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim et haaretz, right? Now, we usually, the most typical translation is in the beginning, right? God created the heaven and the earth. Well, Rambam doesn't really like this word beginning. Well, let's see what he says. I'll let him talk for himself. There's a difference between the first, right, and the principle, meaning the main thing, right?
What page do you want? To what page are you on?
I'm sorry, on page 348 in the Pines. It's part 2, chapter 30. Okay. So know that there is a difference between the first and the principle. So when you say something is first, you're talking in a succession of time, right? There's number one, there's number two. Like the first guy to walk in the store, that's the first. But there's also the main guy, right? Right. He's the guy in charge. He's the guy that's calling all the shots, right? That's the main guy. Namely, a principle right, which I'm calling the main thing, exists in the thing whose principle it is, or simultaneously with it, right? Even if it does not precede it in time. Thus, it is said that the heart of the principle is the principle of the living being. The main part of the living being is the heart, the element, the principle of that of which it is the element, right? I'm not sure how to translate that exactly, but it's not that important for the point that he's making. First is also sometimes used in this sense. Sometimes people also say the first. I'm the first one, right? So sometimes first can correlate with being the main thing too. So, but sometimes, however, the first is applied solely to what is prior in time. It's referring to something which came first in time, even when that which is prior in time is not necessarily the cause of what is posterior to it. Thus, it may be said the first person who lived in that house was the Jones family. The second family that lived there was the Smith family, right? So, and so on and so forth. You can say that, right? It may not, however, be said that this so and so is the principal of so and so, that the main family was the Joneses, and they're the main people that did it, and then the Smiths were less main. It's just a succession in time. That's all. So the word indicative of the first in our language is tchila, right? Right. So which means beginning. So the Rambam is saying, I don't like you saying the beginning, because if it was referring to the beginning in time, right, then one would assume that the word should have been batchila, in the beginning, right? Bar Elokim. So rather, thus the beginning of the word. In other words, when he brings another example, betchilat, right, in the beginning of God speaking to Hosea, the prophet, in the book of Hosea, there was talking about, God had said certain things, and as he started speaking, these are the first things he said to him, and so on. That indicative, however, the word indicative of the principle is reshit, right? Reshit doesn't mean the first or the beginning as a thing in time, but rather it means it comes from the word, it derives from the word rosh, the head, which is the main part of the body, as opposed to, right, which in view of its position, because it's on the top, is the principle of the living being. So it's the main part. So therefore, why is this important? Because the world has not been created in a temporal beginning. At the time of creation, now the Rambam is saying that that sentence that I just said is an oxymoron. You can't say the time of the creation, because at the time of the creation, there was no such thing as time. So we conceive of it that way. But there was no temporal beginning, right? There was no start. Because if you think of it as a start, then you automatically, well, if that's the beginning, if there was time, if that was the first thing, but then there had to be time before it, because time itself was created. As we have explained, for time belongs to the created things. Time itself was created. For this reason, it says, it doesn't say bitchilat, right? Batchila or bihahatchala bara Elokim. In the beginning, God created. But rather, it says bireshit, right? For the bet has the meaning of in, right? So the true translation of the verse should not be in the beginning, but rather in the origin. In the origin, in the event, which was the origin, not beginning, because beginning connotes time, the origin of everything, right? God created what is high and what is low, et hashamayim v'et haaretz. And Rambam understands shamayim and aretz, meaning things that are high up and things that are down. And he'll go into more length into that later. This is the translation that fits in with creation in time. This term creation in time, we should remind ourselves, Rambam has used it over and over again. It means that the world was created at a point, right? As opposed to having always existed. On the other hand, the statement which you find formulated by some of the sages. So here, the Rambam is going to say something interesting. Unlike other writers who tend to ignore those points that seem to contradict what they're trying to say, and like leave them out, like a guy's giving a speech and he only brings the proofs that support him, but he ignores the proofs that negate the point he's trying to make. Rambam here is going to bring a chazal which seems to contradict what he had stated. If you remember, just a couple chapters ago in 26, the Rambam brought up this idea of Rabbi Eliezer from the Perplexed Rabbi Eliezer, who said that what did God create the heavens and the earth out of? and he had something with a cloak and this and that. And the Rambam was very upset about that saying for Rabbi Eliezer because it sounds a lot like how Rambam understands Plato, which is that God created everything out of some primordial substance that always existed. And we discussed that, So and Rabbi Eliezer sounded very similar, and the Rambam says, well, that doesn't help, right? It's just the same thing as Aristotle's, which is saying that the world always existed. To say that there was some primordial substance, that begs the question of, well, who created the primordial substance, and so on. So the Rambam here is going to bring some statements of Chazal that are all, and Rambam over there, if you recall, said, and I don't really understand the pshat. I don't understand what the explanation is for Rabbi Eliezer said, and he rejects the inference out of hand, that even though one might think from Rabbi Eliezer saying that the world always existed, but no, it has to be that the world was created in time. So he's going to bring up a similar problem with the statement that he's about to say. So on the other hand, the statement which you find formulated by some of the sages that affirms that time existed before the creation of the world is very difficult. I'm saying, I know there are statements in Chazal that seem to affirm that there was such a thing as time before that moment of creation. But that is the opinion. It's very difficult. Why? Because that's what Aristotle says, which I have explained to you. He holds that time cannot be conceived to have a beginning, which is incongruous, because the time there always had to have existed. Once you have time, then there must have been time before that, and before that, and before that. So their statements are like Aristotle, and you can't say like Aristotle. Those who made this statement, why did they say this statement? And we're going to hear the statement in a minute. Were conducted to it by their finding in Scripture the terms one day, a second day, and so on, right? The first one, it says, Vayi'er vayivoker yom echad. That's at the end of verse 5, right? And then yom, the next, in verse 8, it says, Vayi'er vayivoker yom sheni, the second day. So they were bothered. What does it mean? Right? There was a first day and a second day, right? He who made the statement understood those terms according to their external sense, right? Rambam is criticizing the rabbis of the Talmud, right? And saying that they looked at it and understood it in its external sense. And Rambam told us already, don't understand it in its external sense, right? When it says Yom Echad, Yom Sheni, right? Yom Echad, Yom Sheni, and so on. It's not to be understood as what it sounds like, but they thought that it was, and therefore they made a mistake. And so they thought like this. If that's the case, inasmuch as a rotating sphere and a sun did not yet exist, which is in the sphere of the sun, didn't exist yet. So whereby was the first day measured? So that was a question that they didn't understand, and they expressed their opinion in the following text. The first day, Rabbi Yehuda, the son of Rabbi Simon, said, hence, we learn that there existed before that an order of time. Time must have existed before that. So whatever period later on became represented as one revolution of the sun around Earth, which we now call 24 hours, right? That same period of time prior to the sun, right? So there must have been time prior to creation. Rabbi Avo said, hence we learn that the Holy One, may his name be blessed, used to create worlds and to destroy them again. So there were suns before that. There were worlds, there were things around before the creation of what we see today. And this second opinion is even more incongruous than the first. Rabbi Abo sounds even weirder, Rambam says, than Rabbi Yehuda's. Consider what was the difficulty for these two sages. What was bothering them that pushed them to say this? It was the notion that time existed prior to the existence of the sun, right? Right. The idea was that time existed beforehand, right? So the solution of what seemed obscure to both of them will soon become clear to you, right? I will explain to you in a minute, right, what the answer to their problem is. Like, what does it mean when it says 1 day, 2 days, if there was no sun and moon yet, right? And how that works. So I'll explain that to you. However, unless by God, those two meant to say that the order of time necessarily exists eternally a parte ante, unless you're going to try to tell me that that's what they really meant. However, is the belief in the eternity a parte ante of the world, and all who adhere to the law should reject it. if that's what they're trying to say, which it certainly sounds like they're trying to say, then it cannot possibly be because something that we can listen to. Because I told you that if you adhere to the Torah, you cannot believe that the world always existed. There has to be a creation. And Rambam told us already why that's so important to our theology of the Torah, that there was a act of creation. And this passage is, to my mind, only the counterpart of the passage in which Rabbi Eliezer said, "Where from were the heavens created?" Remember, we said that before. So he, and remember there, Rambam said explicitly, and I don't really understand what Rabbi Eliezer meant, but don't conclude from there that the world always existed. And the same thing he's saying about what Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Abo are saying. I don't understand exactly what they meant. So Rav Kapach has two possible explanations. That, in other words, I don't understand what they possibly meant. Right? They may have meant something else, but I just don't get it. Right? Just like the Rabbi Eliezer thing. And another interpretation of what Rambam is trying to say is, and if you do think that this is what they really meant, then that's fine. They're wrong. Right? Because it can't be. They were led to a mistake. They're wrong. They're great people, but they were wrong. And you can't listen to this. Okay. And this would not be the only time where the Rambam rejects. And I think we had one last week too. A lone rabbi in the Talmud or the Mishnah who he rejects as a wrong opinion. Right. So those would be two ways of understanding what the Rambam is trying to say regarding them specifically, regarding their statement. To sum up, you should not, but definitely don't, in considering these points, take into account the statements made by this or that one. Don't start thinking about what they said and think, oh, time must have always existed. Don't go down that path. I have already made it known to you, right? And don't think just because they said their statements, that's how you should go. That the foundation of the whole law is the view that the God has brought the world into being out of nothing without there having been a temporal beginning. There was no beginning in time. For time is created, being consequent upon the motion of the sphere which is created. Period. That's it. So don't follow what the simple meaning of those rabbis that he quoted before. Fine. So now the Rambam is going to go into a little bit of an analysis of creation, and it's a little painful to read through some of this because it's understanding Bereshis based on Aristotelean physics. However, that's why I gave the little preamble. But if we think of science as Aristotle, let's try to put our heads into his head in those days where he thought that this was the be all and end all of science, right? And this is how he understood reality to work. And then he starts reading the Torah. How does he make them work, right? And what does he do? And we're going to see an example of this when the simple meaning of the verse seems to contradict what he understood by Aristotelian science was not true, right? Which would be similar to you and I seeing a verse which seems to contradict what we know by modern science to be not true. How does he deal with that problem? And these are all suggestions, not like we saw in the last chapter. These are suggestions, but once we know that the Torah isn't literal here, we can have a lot of leeway with this if the science changes, which, as we know, it did very dramatically. So among the things you ought to know, and on top of page 350 now, is the fact that the sages have explicitly stated in a number of passages that the word es, right, where it says et hashamayim ve'et haaretz, right, has in that verse the meaning with, right? They mean by this that he created together with the heavens all that it is in heaven, and together with the earth all that it is in the earth. So what the Rambam is saying is that all potential was created, as opposed to the Platonic idea that the potential was in a primordial substance which existed before. So the Rambam says there is a primordial substance, but the primordial substance was created at the beginning of the process of creation. And then from that substance, everything was made. So you already know that they make it clear that the heaven and the earth were created together, because he says, I call unto them, they stand up together. So now when we read the Torah and we see Bereshis bara Elokim es hashamayim v'es haaretz, right? And then it starts describing it, right? So what that's saying is that everything was created in the beginning. The primordial substance was there from the start. right? Now, today, you and I might look at this and say, well, that sounds like the Big Bang. Whatever infinitesimally small plunk of matter, God made that. And from that, an entire universe was able to be created from whatever it was that banged and became the Big Bang, right? That thing was created on the first day, right? Now, I might be wrong. If someone proves the Big Bang is wrong tomorrow and comes up with another theory, then we'd understand it differently. But the bottom line is that the fact that it uses this verse as a Shemayim es haaretz, Rambam just explained it in his way of based on how he understood science. Okay, so accordingly, everything was created simultaneously. Then gradually, all things became differentiated, and that's how it all started. Now that we get that, we can watch this whole process unfold. They have compared this to what happens when an agricultural laborer sows various kinds of grain in the soil at the same moment. Right? You throw a bunch of seeds on the ground. Some of them sprout in a day, some in 2 days, some in 3 days, but everything started at the same time. So you plant them all, and then there's a process. 1 comes, 2 comes, 3 comes. The same thing here. You start with the main stuff, and then the heavens and the earth come, and the oceans and the land and the plants and the birds and the trees and the people and so on. Right? Um, it is according to this opinion, which is indubitably correct. It's because of what I just said that the doubt that impelled Rabbi Yehuda, the son of Rabbi Simon, the one who we quoted before, to say what he said, may be resolved, right? In other words, he was bothered by how is it possible that they measured 1 day, 2 days, if the sun didn't exist yet, and a day is the revolution of the sun. So what's going on, right? How is it possible that we measure time by the movement of the sun? If there's no movement of the sun, how do you measure days? So the Rambam says, but I just answered it for you, because it was difficult for him to understand whereby the first day and the second and the third day were measured. So I'll explain it to you. There's an explicit statement on this point made by the sages in Bereshis Rabbah with reference to the light said in the Torah to have been created on the first day. They made literally the following statement: those are the luminaries that have been created on the first day, but that he did not suspend until the fourth day. In other words, there was a sun, right? And there was time. There was a way to measure that. And it was all created on the first day, right? Thus, a clear explanation as to this point has been made. So that's what it means, right? The first day doesn't mean a revolution of the sun, right? But the sun, all the potential for there to be a day existed on the first day. Among the things you ought to know, I don't know if I fully understand what the Rambam is saying, so I'm not going to go. But if you can, but I'm reading it, for what he says. Okay, so among the things, remember the Rambam did not like Rabbi Yehuda's answer. That he's not dealing with. We dealt with that before, and he wants to make sure we don't go down that path of thinking that time is eternal. Among the things you ought to know is that earth is an equivocal term. So now I'm going to continue going. When it says the term the haaretz, aretz or eretz is an equivocal term, meaning it means different things. Now, this is similar to today. Like, so today we can look at the earth and call it planet Earth, right? Now, on planet Earth, there's lots and lots of different stuff, right? There's water and there's land. So sometimes we pick up we pick up a clump of earth and we call it earth, right? As opposed to picking up a handful of water and we call that water. So the earth is a material, right? So the Rambam, in his conception, earth meant everything below the sphere of the moon. In other words, in the world, the atmosphere that we live in, right? So among the things you ought to know is that earth is equivalent to mean in a general and a particular sense. In a general sense, it means everything beneath the sphere of the moon, which refers to the 4 elements which make up everything that we see. In a particular sense, it's applied to one element, which is earth, as opposed to air, fire, and water, right? Which those 3 plus earth make up the 4 elements. A proof of this is his saying, and the earth was unformed and void, and the darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God, and so on. So if you look at it, it says, the world was, v'choshech al pnei tehom, and there was darkness, and that was not referring to earth as opposed to, as the first statement of earth is not talking about earth as opposed to water, or earth as opposed to, land as opposed to sea, or earth as opposed to space, or something like that. It was referring to All the stuff that's down here was earth. That's what it means, right? Thus, sometimes all the elements are called earth. So earth can include everything. Afterwards, he said, and God called the dry land earth, right? Later in verse 10, which is in the third day already, right? That's when God said, right? Eretz. I was just reading verse 9 and 10. And God called the dry land earth. So now God further specified it. Why is this important? You're going to see soon why this process. So remember, number one, Rambam laid out the thing that on the first day, everything was created, right? Or the potential for everything. And then the process of Bereshit was simply a process of bringing that to the perfection that we see today. Number two, he says when God uses terms often refer to a broader idea and then become more particular. So he does, so whenever you find it saying in the Torah, God names something, thus, when you name something, then you're particularizing it. He does this in order to differentiate between the particular notion of Israel and the other notion equally signified by the term. Before, the word earth referred to all the stuff. Now, all right, the verse refers to only the earth as opposed to the sea, right? And as opposed to the other elements. So for this reason, I've interpreted the verse as follows. So now we can read in the origin, right? So right, remember, in the origin, not in the beginning, God created what is high and what is low. Hence, the earth mentioned in the first place is what is low, meaning all the stuff that's down here, right? I mean to say all the four elements. Whereas, because I told you that all potential is here. Whereas the earth of which it is said, and God called the dry land earth, is the element of earth alone. This is now clear. All right. So now we move on. He's continuing on his way through the first couple verses. So the next thing after happened is Vayomer Lim Yehi Or, let there be light. Vayi Or. That's verse 3, right? And it says Vayar Elohim es ha'or ki tov. God saw light is good. Vayavdel Elohim ben or ben choshech. He divided between light and dark. Okay, so the next thing, among the things you ought to know is that the four elements are the first to be mentioned after the heaven. I mentioned, Rambam says there was heaven and earth. Those are the stuff that's above there, above the sphere of the moon. The arts meaning below the sphere of the moon, right? So all four elements are the next things written. For we have said the term earth applies to them. Earth applies to all four. For he mentions earth, but then he specifies earth, right? And he also talks about spirit, air, ruach, right? Ruach Elohim, the spirit of God, meaning the air, right? Or the wind, and the darkness, right? So, because it says, v'choshech al pnei tehom, right? Now, darkness, when it calls darkness, what is darkness? Remember, we look at darkness as an absence of light, right? Because we understand the concept of space and a vacuum, right? So there could be light pulsing through there. There could be darkness going through there. So when Rambam did not, and he's going to emphasize this before, and we've had it before, did not believe that there was, an Aristotelean science did not believe that a vacuum was possible. There's no such thing as a vacuum. So if you see a place that's dark, right, darkness, right, is a thing. It's a substance. Which element makes up darkness? It's fire, right? Do not think anything else, right? And he says, because we see in the Torah, it says in the prophets, and thou didst hear his words out of the midst of the fire. And then he says, what you heard his voice out of the midst of the darkness. That's a verse from Eo, from the book of Job. Or then we have this interesting verse here, which he brings from Devarim, where which you might be a little more familiar with. I'm sorry, Deuteronomy 5:20. So this following verse, Vayihi kishamachem, it was talking about the standing at Sinai. And it was when you heard at Takol mitoch hachoshech, the sound of God's voice coming from the darkness, v'hahar ba'er ba'esh, and the mountain was burning in flame. So it was burning in flame, but he was calling it darkness. All right. So the elemental fire, fire, they thought of fire as an element, right? One of the elements. So was designated by the term not because it's not because it is luminous, but it's transparent. So the element of fire is also the element of darkness. For if the elemental fire had been luminous, we should have seen at night the whole atmosphere in a flame like fire. So the elemental fire, when we look in the atmosphere, we're seeing fire, but it's dark. So darkness could be the element of fire. The elements are mentioned according to their natural position. First, the earth. So when we look at it, right, the Aretz is the first, right, which is the lowest, right? Right? Uh, then the water that is above it, then the air that adheres to the water, and then the fire that it is above the air, right? So the mayim, the earth is all the way on the bottom, and then there's water, and then there's ruach on top of that, and then there's eish on top of that. And in the whole Aristotelean physics, that's the order. That's how it goes. So you see how he's reading Aristotelean physics into these verses. Okay. Now you and I might look at this and translate it in completely different ways, but this is how the Rambam understood it. So the idea that the earth is the bottom is the heaviest, and then the water is the next one, and then wind is the next one, and then fire is the top one, right? The whole idea, and then the spheres force them to mix in different ways, and it's when you force them to mix, that's how you create all the different things and items on this world. That's how Aristotle understood physics. For in view of the specification of the air as being over the face of the waters, darkness that is upon the face of the deep, it is indubitably above the spirit, right? We just read that verse together. It was impelled to use this expression, the spirit of God, right? Why did it call it Beruach Elokim if it's referring to just the element? Why does it call it Ruach Elokim? So it does that in order to designate the air in view of the fact that the latter is supposed to be in motion, right? And motion, that because it says that was what was moving, right? The other stuff was still at this time. And movement, is always ascribed to God. Remember, God is the prime mover in Aristotelian physics. That's what Aristotle used to call God, the prime mover. And because it had to say the Ruach was moving, it called it the spirit of God, because God is the one that makes everything move. And it's the movement of the spheres that causes every phenomenon that we see in this world happen. That's why I said it's painful to read, because our understanding of physics is so vastly and dramatically different. But to Rambam, this was basic science, right? So we have to screw our heads on a little different when we read this. And then you could see how he would look at the verse and say, oh, that's why it says Ruach Elohim, it makes sense, right? Okay. Thus, and there went forth a wind from the Lord. I just blow with thy wind, and the Lord to the west wind. He just brings other examples where God causing a wind is just referring to God's causing motion to happen, which is God making everything happen. This occurs frequently. There are a lot of verses like that. In view of the fact that the term darkness, as employed in the first place, which designates the element, which I explained means the element of fire, differs in its meaning from the term darkness, right? So remember he said that the word eretz is an inclusive term, the word earth, and it's also an exclusive term, which refers to only a specific one of the elements. So the word darkness is the same. Darkness could refer to the entire element, that element which is light or lack thereof, right? But he's thinking of it as a substance, right? That we don't view it as a substance. We view light and energy as something else, but he views it as a substance. So, and it differs from its meaning from the later term of darkness, right? When God says, right, Olachoshech kara laila. So if you look a little later, right, in verse, where are we? In verse 5, right? So it started out, there was the choshech, right? Al pnei tehom, which was the darkness, which refers to the whole element of fire, which includes both dark and light. But then within that element, God divided between the fire, which is light that we see, and the fire, which is dark that we don't see, right? And God called la'aryom olachoshech kara laila. So now, remember, and Rambam said, when God calls something, that means he's further specifying it. He's further specializing it, right? So now he's saying choshech used to mean the big, all that stuff, and now it only means this specific stuff, right? So as employed afterwards in the signification of obscurity, it begins to explain and differentiate, saying, and the darkness he called night, as we have explained, consequently, this is now clear. All right. So then, so I mean, this is it's hard, because I know I said this a few times already, because we really if we fall into the trap of thinking that this is what the words actually mean, right? Then we start wondering, well, hey, Rambam, if this is what they mean, then 200, 500 years later, 700 years, whenever it was that Copernicus came around and we've disproved this whole system, right? Um, then what does Bereshis mean anymore? So that's why it's important to remind ourselves that this is what the Rambam is trying to teach us, that I could learn Bereshis, learn the words, and still know Aristotelean science, and it works fine, right? That's what he's trying to say. And the same thing we can do today, and the same thing 500 years from now we'll be able to do, right? Because the words of Bereshis aren't literal. So he's teaching us how to do that. This is his path. But let's move on, because he's going to continue. And the next one, right? So he just analyzed the first parsha, right? The first day. So now he's going to go on the second day. And he touched a little bit into the third day just to talk about Eretz, earth, but he just analyzed a very in-depth analysis of the first 5 verses. So now let's go to the next one, which is the second day. Let's look at the Torah for a minute. God said there should be some kind of, I'm going to translate, a firmament, right? Whatever that means, but within the water. Vihi mavdil bein mayim l'mayim, right? And it should be what separates between the waters and the waters. Vayas Elohim es harakia, and God created this firmament. Vayabdel bein hamayim asher mitachas l'rakia, and it divided between the water that's above this firmament, uvein hamayim asher mi'al l'rakia, and the water that's above it. I'm sorry, the water that's below and the water that's above. Vayihi chen, and so it was. Vayikra Elohim l'rakia shamayim, and God called this firmament the shamayim, the heaven. Vayer vayivoker yom sheni. So there's a lot. This is the hardest day of the days of creation to really understand what in the world it's talking about. So the Rambam is going to tell us a little bit about what it's talking about. And let me give you a hint. You guys should remember that the Rambam taught us before that the nature of what exists above the sphere of the moon is very different from the nature of what exists below the sphere of the moon, and that we don't understand the nature of what goes on above because it doesn't make sense. Aristotelian physics stops working as soon as you get above that sphere. And the Rambam said that. We went into it in length. So in other words, so the Rambam is going to understand that this rakia is the dividing point between where the nature of stuff changes. It was all comes from that primordial stuff that was created on the first day. Because remember, it says God created the heavens and the earth, right? What's above that firmament and what's below. But the stuff that's below, we understand. We got the 4 elements, we got the movement, we got it all down pat, right? But the stuff that happens above that of the moon, the Rambam already showed it just doesn't follow the rules of physics, at least the way he understood them. So it just didn't. How could this go this way and this go that way and let's go that way? It just didn't. He explained us a million reasons why we didn't understand it. So that's how he's gonna analyze this. So it's gonna be a little bit of a long analysis, but let's see what we can do. All right. Among the things you ought to know is that the words "and he divided between the waters" and so on do not refer merely to a division in place in which one part is located above and one below, while both have the same nature. It doesn't mean that there was a bunch of water and God puts water there and water there, right? Which one might think. Remember, if one looks at the simple meaning of the verse, one might think that. But the Rambam already told us that what's above and below are not the same. You can't call them both water. They're different, right? So the correct interpretation of these words is that he made a natural division between both of them. Not so much a division in space, but a division in nature. I mean, with regard to their form, making one part that which he first calls water, right? The stuff that's into one particular thing by means of the natural form with which he vested in it. So in other words, the stuff that we find below that, I'm going to now call that a special water, right? And bestowing on the other part, the latter being called water proper, right? A different form. So the stuff above it will be a different kind of thing. It'll also have originated in the original primordial water, but the stuff above the rakia has a totally different nature than the stuff below the rakia. Hence it says, and the gathering of the waters he called seas, right? Remember, following the same pattern, that there was a big subject called water, and now it's specified, more specific. In this way, he makes it clear to you that the first water, of which it is said over the face of the waters, when it said God was merachefet al pnei hamayim, that the Spirit of God was talking about the big picture water, right? This is the different thing. This is now the water in the seas. So when it says, and God, later it says that Yikavu Hamayim, the water should gather in the seas. That's a water with a totally different nature. But the stuff that is above is not the water that is in the seas, but that part of the water situated above the air was differentiated by means of a certain form. It's a different kind of thing, where another part is the water here, which is the kind of water that you and I are familiar with. Thus the phrase, and he divided between the waters which were under and so on, and the waters above, is similar to the phrase where God said divided between the light and the darkness. Remember, light and darkness were one element, but then God made two different expressions of that element, further specified it. And the same thing God did with the water. What you're going to see is the entire Bereshit is a pattern of specifying and specifying and specifying and making things more and more and more unique and creating more and more different kinds of things out of the same substance, which is not that much different if we really think about it to the way we understand science today, right? There's a basic substance, which is made up of what makes up atoms and molecules. And from those things, right, different molecules are made, and those molecules gather together to make all different kinds of forms and shapes and things, which we call everything that we see, right? Obviously, it's an extremely different concept, but the same idea that there's a basic substance from which everything came out and became more and more specified. And God divided between the light and the dark. And okay, I said that. The firmament itself was produced from water. As the sages say, the middle group congealed, right? To the words, and God called the firmament heaven, is intended, according to what I've explained, to make clear that the term is equivocal, right? So the word heaven itself has changed its meaning, because it said at first, Bereshit bara Elokim et hashamayim, right? That heaven had a very broad meaning, right? In the first place, the words heaven and the earth is not what is general, but that's not when you and I say heaven, we're not referring to the heaven that it meant in the first verse. We're referring to about the sphere of the moon in Aristotelean physics again, right? That's heaven. What we see up there, that's heaven, because above it, nature changes, okay? It has rendered this signification even more certain by the use of the words in the face of the firmament of heaven, whereby it meant to make clear that the firmament is not the heaven. Because of this equivocality of the terms, the true heaven is sometimes likewise called firmament, just like the true firmament is called heaven. Thus it says, and God set them in the firmament of the heaven, because the word is interchangeable. In these words, there is likewise a clear indication of what has already been demonstrated, namely of the fact that all the stars, as well as the sun and the moon, are situated within that sphere, as there is no vacuum in the world, right? Rambam made that point many times. They did not conceive of a vacuum, right? So, and that they are not located upon the surface of the sphere, as the vulgar imagine. In other words, but they're embedded within it. This appears from his saying in the firmament of the heaven and not upon the firmament of the heaven. It's not like there's a heaven and then the moon is plunked on top of it, kind of like sticking to it and running around, but rather it's embedded within whatever matter it is that makes up the heaven. Thus it has become clear, and mind you, the fact that there's a substance that fills space was thought until the turn of the 20th century, the ether, there was always thought to be some sort of a substance that made up space, but fine. Thus it has become clear that there was a certain common matter, which it names water. Afterwards, it was divided into three forms. A part of it, which is the seas down here, a part of it is the firmament that divides, and a part of it was above that. The latter is entirely beyond the earth. The stuff that's above it is all the way up there. With regard to that subject, he chose a different method of approach, leading to extraordinary secrets. With regard to the fact, I'm sorry, just give me 1 second. I just got to take a drink. I'm tiring out my throat here. So right. So that water that's above the heavens is this extraordinarily secretive thing that we can't understand the nature of it. And now Rambam is going to try to explain a very odd, very strange, mystical saying of Chazal, and he's going to give us a little flash of a way that you might understand it, right? And it's the famous Chazal that talks about Arba nichnasu lapardes. 4 of the Tanoim went up to heaven, right? In this mystical experience. The only one who survived was Rabbi Akiva. But so with regard to the fact that which is above the firmament is called water in name only, and that it is not the specific water known to us. This is what I'm trying to tell you, that the water that's up there is not at all the same as the water that's down here. A statement setting this forth has also been made by the sages, may their memory be blessed. They made it in the following passage. Four entered the Pardes, and so on. Rabbi Akiva said to them, Rabbi Akiva instructed the others, when you come to the stones of pure marble, do not say water, water. For it is written, excuse me, he that speaketh falsehood shall not be established before mine eyes. It's a very odd sounding phrase. No one really understands what it means. When you read the Gemara, no one really knows what it means. But the Rambam is telling you that I think what he means is that Rabbi Akiva was saying you're going to see something that appears is the water that's found up in the heavenly spheres. Don't call it water because it's not really water. It's something else. So here you have an explanation, a potential explanation, which according to Rambam is scientifically valid, because remember, Rambam made clear that the nature of matter above the spheres is different from the nature of matter beneath the sphere of the moon where we live. Reflect, if you are one of those who reflect, to what extent he has made clear and revealed the whole matter, and say, think about how my explanation makes sense in the words of Rabbi Akiva, provided that you consider it well. Understand all that has been demonstrated in the Meteorologica, which is Aristotle's book on all this stuff, right? So, and it has been demonstrated. It's a very deliberate translation, because the Rambam when Rambam says demonstrated, he thinks of it as scientifically proven, right? That's the strongest word for a fact that he can bring about. And examine everything that people have said about every point mentioned in that work. So read through the science book, the Rambam says, and then when you go through Chazal and when you go through the Torah, you'll find these explanations just like I showed you. Okay, so this is it's going to go on for a while. I don't know if we'll be able to finish this chapter next week, but I'm going to try. But I think I'm at a good stopping point, and my head is a little tired. So let's stop here, and let me open the floor for comments before we close up for today.
I have maybe a stupid question, but maybe I'll let you judge whether it's stupid. What's the point of all this? Where does this lead us?
No, it's not a stupid question at all, and it's a question I ask myself too, right?
Okay.
So that's why I think, this is my understanding. I mean, if you have a better one, I'm all ears, because it's hard to read. So the bottom line that the Rambam is saying is that don't read Bereshis literally, and that's why he gave that as his introduction, right? If you were to read everything literally, right, then you would come up with something ridiculous, right? And something ridiculous that doesn't make any scientific sense, right? Now, remember, when Rambam used the word scientific sense, he was thinking Aristotelean science, right? So therefore, he says, if you don't take Bereshis literally, I could make it make scientific sense. And not only that, but it'll make beautiful scientific sense, and it'll all work, right? And the point is that when you and I read Bereshis, we should do the same thing, right? Don't take the words literally, right? Study the science, like he said, read Aristotle's book, Meteorologica, so you know what's going on, right? And then read the words and understand that this is referring to the processes that we know of today as science, right? But don't read the words literally. Don't translate them literally. So that gives us license to reading Bereshis and not saying, oh, this is ridiculous because this is nothing. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Let me ask you this. I mean, on the second day,
right?
It said, okay, this water, and he separates water from water.
Mm-hmm.
Now, when I always read this, since we've been reading this for a while, I said, look, that's absurd. I mean, there's no water up there. I know where water is. And then I think, well, okay, so isn't it almost apparent that you can't read this thing as water, because you just know, and everybody knows that there's not water, and it says no, call the thing up there sky. Well, sky, but that's not water. So you think, well, he must have some strange definition of water. So you immediately.
So you heard so now the Rambam just told you the answer to that question.
He comes up, well, but the idea that you're just opening up the key to not reading things literally. It seems to me it's obvious you can't read this literally, because we know this isn't water.
By the way, in the paragraph that we're about to read, that I didn't read, right? If you look a little bit down, the Rambam makes exactly the point that you just said. All right.
Okay.
I'm going to find the words. It said,
Okay.
so, but there is something hidden, as you will see. This is a little bit farther down on 353 with regard to the firmament and the thing above it, which is called water.
Okay.
For if the matter is considered according to its external meaning, if you look at the word water as if it means water, and with the recourse only to superficial speculation, in other words, you're reading it based on a superficial meaning, it does not exist at all. There is no such water up there.
Right.
Right.
Okay.
So therefore, right. So it must really mean something else.
Mm-hmm.
And then the Rambam suggested that it means the substance that's up there in the heavens that's different than the substance we see down here. Okay. Right. So that's literally, that's like you just plucked out the Rambam's words exactly.
Okay.
You know, and that's the point. So now, if you and I now go ahead and prove, so what would I say today? What does it mean by Abdul Bein Mayim L'Mayim? What does that mean? I don't know. Maybe who I don't know. I mean, we'll have to come up with something, you know. But the truth is that ultimately by now, I mean, I don't know what it means. I don't. We'll ever know it. Maybe one day we'll know what it means. You know. But
Okay. I mean, then he goes on and just look. So well, this is true. He says, well,
right.
What this means is it's concealed. So the vulgar, and I take that personally, and
right.
should not know it. Okay. Okay,
right.
that's good to know.
In other words, there may be things up there that we don't understand, right? And it's trying to tell us that there are certain things. Maybe this is the shot. The water that we see, we can figure it out that it's made out of 2 hydrogens and an oxygen, and we could learn its properties and see what it does when it freezes and when it boils and so on and so forth, right? But the stuff that's up there, we'll never figure out. You know, there's going to be stuff maybe that's the point. I honestly, I don't know, but I mean, I'm open to there's people that write books, you know, trying to reconcile science with Genesis. Maybe some of them have good points. I don't know. You know, the main thing that we should learn is it's not literal.
Okay.
And don't throw, and Rambam doesn't consider for a second to throw science out. He tells you the opposite. Read Aristotle's Meteorologica, know everything that's in there, get it straight, then learn Bereshis, right? Don't throw science out because it doesn't match up with exactly what it says in Bereshis. I think that those are the most important points.
Okay. Okay.
Okay.
Okay. I'm with you. Good. Thank you.
All right. You're welcome. Have a wonderful evening. Looking forward to next week.
Okay. So am I.
All right. Yes.
Bye-bye.